You're tuning into the O&P Check-in, an SPS podcast. I'm Brendan Erickson, a regional sales manager at SPS. This show brings you the latest happenings in the O&P industry. We're unpacking trends and news from this tight-knit orthotics and prosthetics community. Co-hosting with me today is SPS Sales Account Manager Travis Ricks.
Stoked to be here, Brendan.
Yeah, let's do it, buddy. Let's get started.
Looking for a prosthetic foot that keeps up with your patient's active lifestyles? The Taleo Adapt from Ottobock features a hydraulic ankle that adjusts to uneven terrain, slopes, and a daily life for a smoother, more natural gait. Waterproof and designed for all-day comfort, it helps reduce socket pressure and compensatory movements. Learn more and order today at spsco.com.
Elevate your expertise at our free in-person SPS Clinical Education Days. Join the SPS Clinical Services team alongside industry leaders from Alps, Click Medical, PhilHour, Integrum, O&P Insight, and Willowwood for an engaging day of learning and professional development. This year, we're excited to introduce our new dual track program, with different cities offering either Track 1 or Track 2. This gives you flexibility to choose the location and curriculum that matches your interests. Whether you attend one event or experience both tracks, you'll discover innovative solutions to enhance your clinic workflow and transform patient outcomes. Follow the link in our show notes for more info. Hello, listeners. Today we have the privilege of speaking with a true expert in the field, Surestep's Director of Education and Research, Katie Toth. She's here to share with us insight into the world of cranial remolding. Katie, we're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always like to start with just a basic question. And can you share a bit about yourself and what led you to work in O&P?
Sure. So my father had an accident when I was about 5 years old and became a paraplegic. He fell off the roof. And with that, he got involved in a lot of adaptive sports. So he still to this day is an avid golfer. He uses a adaptive cart that rotates 360 degrees. But while growing up, he spent a lot of time running sports clinics for patients that have limb differences, MS, ALS, etc. So I've been around AFOs, KFOs, and prosthetics for most of my youth. So it was always something that was interesting to me. I ended up going to school for it. And then once I got in school, I always have had a passion for neuro, but stumbled into pediatrics and really haven't looked back since.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great, Katie. I'm sure your name sounds familiar, so I think I've heard of your dad before through my years in adaptive sports. So
Said a few hole-in-ones.
Yeah. Well,
oh, that's amazing. Holes in ones?
Said 4.
Wow.
That's impressive.
I'm still on 0.
I'm still trying to hit the green. Well, to get into today's topic, what is cranial remolding and what head shapes or diagnoses typically require intervention?
So cranial remolding is kind of a large bucket that we use. There's 2 main diagnoses that fall under that. So there's kind of our deformational head shapes, or our kiddos that have positional deformities of their head, if you will. And then there's the cranial synostosis population, or kiddos that have sutures that have fused prematurely. So the sprout focuses just on our deformational cases, but overall, cranial remolding works by just making contact in areas where we don't want growth and putting void spaces on areas where we do want growth. So as that brain grows and expands, it pushes into the path of least resistance and corrects that overall head shape or flatness. Very simple in its nature, if you will.
Yeah, and I think most people have seen this either in public or had experience with it in the past. And I mean, what a great service you guys are doing. And I think the technology is ever increasing. And I think we're here to talk a little bit about that today. As 3D printing transformed within O&P and what makes it especially well suited for cranial care.
I think cranial care is especially well suited for 3D printing because when you talk about cranial kids' head shapes, we're quantifying things in millimeters. So kids are coming into the office and we're saying, you grew 5 millimeters in circumference. And when we talk about hand measurements, we often say you can be up to 0 to 3 millimeters of sway in your measurement. You take that measurement 3 times, you take an average. 3 millimeters could be the difference for a kiddo being classified as a moderate deformity versus a severe deformity. So 3D printing allows us to really refine that accuracy. And when you talk about clinicians spending a ton of time, say, prepping and taking a beautiful 3D scan, right? They take a great 3D scan, then we're going to take that 3D scan, we're going to modify it via CAD CAM, and then we're going to have it carved. So you may lose accuracy right when that head shape is carved. And then how was the vacuum that day? We're drape forming foam around that 3D model. And then how was the vacuum when we pulled the plastic? Was the plastic thin that day? Was it thick? What tech is pulling that plastic? Then we're relying on a 3D carver to carve out, and then another tech to finish it. So you've taken a really accurate 3D scan. My scanner, when I was practicing for 12 years in pediatric orthotics, was accurate up to less than a millimeter. That's what makes 3D printing really cool, is we can maintain that accuracy from that 3D scan all the way to it reaching the patient, which ultimately is going to just provide better outcomes down the line.
That's pretty cool. That's a lot of amazing work that goes into such a small little helmet, right? So, speaking of the scanning and the fabrication, do you have any tips for anybody listening for how to capture an accurate scan for fabrication?
So the first big thing with Sprout, which typically a little bit more unique to our fabrication process, is we want those ears cut out of the sock itself. We've tried various ways of doing this when we were developing the product, but we found that when the ears were out of the scan, even if your scanner makes it kind of look like Mike Tyson, if you will, it's not going to give you a perfect ear anatomy. When the ears are out of the scan, we're more accurately able to place those ear cutouts, which give a better overall clinical experience and prevent window edema and things like that for kids. My biggest thing from a clinical perspective, especially when I was practicing, is a lot of these scanners are remarkably distracting. They flash these more or less QR codes that babies unsurprisingly love to stare at. So I always start with the posterior aspect of the head. If you have a parent that's able to stand in front of them and use a distractive toy or their favorite toy, perhaps, scan the posterior aspect of the head. We really need good capture of that occipital area, that mastoid area. If you have a little boy that's come in, or a little girl even with a collared shirt on, kind of like mine, not that you'll see this in the podcast, but if you have a little boy or girl that comes in with a collared shirt, taking the time and being comfortable with tucking that shirt down and in so that you're actually able to get more purchase and more 3D data collected of that neck and that occipital area. Babies don't really have necks when you really think about their anatomy in comparison to how big their head is. So it can be really challenging if you have a lot of material around that neck area to get an accurate scan. Once the posterior and kind of sides of the head are done, I'll do the top. And then the second you hit their peripheral vision, they're going to stare right at the scanner. So you can kind of get the face usually pretty easily from that point.
Wow, that's really cool. A lot of logistics go into that. And I think we always, at the foremost, think about the patient and the end users that we're creating these for. Is there a step between scanning to fabbing where you do reductions or some type of tweak here and there? And is that through the CAD CAM or whatever the technology is?
So when you have the option to select different modifications when you're in the ordering platform, which is pretty cool. So you will select your patient's diagnosis. So again, this is only deformational at this point in time. So you'll select plagiocephaly, brachycephaly, asymmetric brachycephaly we have listed, and scaphocephaly, which we see very few of those in the wild, if you will. But once you select that diagnosis, it'll populate what modifications you can actually choose from. So if you select deformational plagiocephaly, only that plagio mod button will show up, but you'll be able to select whether you want that to CDC growth chart predictors, whether you want the CAD CAM team to just put void in the posterior quadrant so you don't have a crow that moves, or whether you want standard modifications, where it's just they modify in up to 2 centimeters of circumferential growth. So that might be a crow that you need to put a little padding on in the interim, but a crow for a kiddo that's going to grow really rapidly might be a great choice. And then in the brachy space, we have focus on proportion, focus on asymmetry for kiddos that might have like that asymmetric brachy head where they have moderate transcranial diagonal difference with some cephalic index. And then we have, again, our standard, which is just 2 centimeters, kind of building that head as close to full symmetry as we can. But that's another cool piece, is we're giving that clinical power back where they get to choose as a clinician, what modifications would you like? There's also a small special instructions box there where if you're really specific, where you're like, this kiddo's at 99% cephalic index and I'd like it just reduced down to 94, you can write that note and our team will pay attention to that and make sure we modify that in.
Well, that's pretty awesome. And is that interface through your PC, or is it through an app, or is it through the scanning mechanism?
It's going to be right on the Surestep website. So we have our Sprout order and you'll go in and work through that. The only thing that you'll notice that isn't there compared to maybe some other orders is you're not going to be able to select a mastoid cut-in or an occipital cut-in, because we've standardized that so well over our pilot, and we've now fabricated over 2,000 of these devices out in the field, which is very cool. We fine-tune those modifications so that we're not going to allow a ton of discrepancy in the way the mastoid and occipital modifications are performed.
And I imagine, and I'm just going down the future here, Like I imagine with 3D printing and the technology that you guys have, it's easy to go backwards and see what you've done if you need to make an edit. Or we always talk about outcomes and measures. I'm sure with all of this data that you guys are collecting, you're able to find outcomes a little bit better and measure them, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really powerful piece for me about 3D printing is previous to this, you'd put a traditional crow on a kiddo and you're like, that one fit really strange. You might email the fab and you're like, hey, like, can you send me maybe how this one was missed? Or, was there an odd modification here? And usually it ended in like we're not sure, like could have just been a one-off, or you get one where like the mastoid is almost like a flat line because they clearly lost vacuum or something happened in the carving process. But that's been the really cool piece about Sprout when we have a crow that we have like an odd fit issue where we've cut into the occipital too much. We are empowered or able to change our modifications very quickly to reduce that occipital cut in, on all brachy kids that fall in this bucket, because we know if we cut into an occipital area that can't be cut into, it's going to tip down and hit them in the nose. So I think that has allowed us to make very quick and efficient changes to the modifications we're doing in a way that we weren't able to really problem solve before.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, I've got a 2.5-year-old and a 5.5-year-old, and I'm constantly losing their stuff. Like, I mean, you can just replicate this, right? If for some reason a parent loses the helmet, or maybe the child throws it out the window, who knows?
Yeah, if the parent, and that's the cool thing, if the parent loses the helmet, God forbid, something happens to it, it gets run over by a car, who knows? As long as it's fitting well, we can literally just take that and duplicate it. It's no longer, we're not. The vacuum process, I think, made us a little bit more hesitant in cranial remolding to ever duplicate a helmet off a scan from 6 weeks ago. But as long as that's fitting well, we can take that exact rendering of the crow that we made for that kiddo and just reprint it and get it to that patient in a timely fashion so they're not out of their crow for a month because you're waiting for new authorization, et cetera.
Wow. From what I can tell and what people have told me, parents and caregivers often face a lot of challenges when they're managing their baby's head shape abnormalities. In your opinion, what are the most common concerns from the parents?
Yeah, I think the big three, or even two for me, are like most often when I was getting feedback from parents when I was in clinical practice. And even as we've developed the Sprout, feedback that I've gotten from clinicians in the field are sweating, perspiration, which I think is generally a problem across the board in O&P. But when you talk about putting something intimately fitting on an infant that can't really give you that direct feedback of, hey, I'm a little hot, it's different than necessarily wearing a prosthesis where you could remove it because you have the awareness that you're overheating. So it's perspiration, it's skin irritation issues, which can come, from a variety of issues, whether that be cleaning, alcohol, what they're cleaning the helmet with. And lastly, a lot of parents have concerns about the weight of the device. You have an infant that may not have a ton of head control. What does that head control look like when we put a device on their head if they're already having trouble keeping their head upright?
Wow. So the Sprout 3D was just released back in February, correct?
Yes.
So how does Surestep Sprout 3D actually address some of these challenges that you speak of?
Yeah, so that was one of our main focuses. I was one of the clinical brains behind developing the Sprout 3D, which was a very cool career milestone for me as someone who's incredibly passionate, as you can probably pick up on cranial remolding. So we wanted to make sure, as Surestep, someone that's not necessarily in the cranial space, hasn't been in the cranial space until this February of 2025, we wanted to make sure that when we brought a crow to market, that it was something that actually addressed the needs of the field and not just a copycat device. So when we talk about sweating, we have perforated foam that's actually perforated all the way through that foam material. We perforate that foam and make sure that the glue is not obscuring the holes. So you're actually getting airflow through that device. There's not like a double-sided tape or anything that's necessarily between the foam and the frame. So when that kiddo is wearing it, because of our double wall, you're actually going to get airflow and cooling. And because of the additional rigidity of the 3D printed material, we can be a lot more flexible with our superior openings. When you have less material on the superior opening, you're able to get more airflow because there's less stuff on the top of that kiddo's head. So when you talk about ventilating, if you think about babies, like a third of their body is their head. So if we're encompassing all of that in plastic material, they really can't allow for heat escape from their head because we're insulating it. When we talk about skin irritation, we use a medical grade plastizote foam. We didn't see any issues with skin irritation in the pilot study we did. We've had some skin irritation since then, but it's been very easily mitigated issues like You'll see on our wear and care guide that we encourage parents to take a clean paper towel and wipe out the inside of that device, no matter what they clean it with. Because if you think about, you wash a crow at bath time, that kiddo's been in a nice bath, their pores are open. I've just washed my cranial remolding device with rubbing alcohol, and I haven't wiped it down with anything. I'm going to put this on my baby's head. Their pores are open. All of that alcohol remarkably dries out skin and can create some wild skin reactions that can leave these kids out of the device for 3, 4, 5 days as that area heals, or have the parents lathering, crazy amounts of Aquaphor just to try to get that peeling and dry skin to soften up. So that's why we have that in our wear care guide, getting that residue, whether it be soap, alcohol, etc., out of the device. And lastly, when it comes to weight, every kiddo in the pilot that we made a Sprout for, we also made a traditional device for. And we weighed each of those crows, and the Sprout was 20% lighter on average compared to the traditional device. We wanted to try to compare that to other things in the field, but with cranial, there's just so many variables, head shape, diagnosis, male, female, etc. So we're not at a place where we would ever compare them to other 3D crows in the field. But when we're comparing our traditional crow that we were fitting to a kiddo to a Sprout, it's about 20% lighter, which helps with those kiddos that are already struggling with floor mobility or head control.
Wow, it sounds like an awesome design, and congratulations for, your success in this and probably a long, long journey. And I sure hope that a lot of people are listening and taking this into account and have an open mind to try it out. And so you talked about all the benefits for the patient, how to kind of mitigate some of those concerns. As we turn more towards the actual fitter and the fabricator, from scanning all the way to fab to the fitting, what efficiencies can a clinician see or expect to gain by using the Sprout 3D?
I think the coolest thing for me is good input is going to yield good output. If you give us a great scan where you've gotten great capture of the occipital area, the mastoid area, your ears, your facial structure, you should get a crow that requires very little modification at that fitting appointment. The cool thing for me with that is, a lot of clinicians, myself included, when I was in the field, you have an hour appointment for delivery. I'm spending 40 minutes of that sometimes grinding on a traditional device, fine-tuning it, making sure it doesn't rotate, trimming out the ears, the frontal area, etc. 40 minutes of that appointment is just this kind of kiddo sitting in a room with their parent, just twiddling their thumbs. Mom or dad is trying to entertain this kiddo. And then the last 20 minutes of that appointment, are you going through wear care, perhaps rushing through it, going through maybe or maybe not allowing mom or dad to put the crow on in the office so they're comfortable with doing it with your supervision. You're rushing through all of that. And if we can give you more clinical time back, more clinical efficiency back, we can mitigate a lot of those emails, texts, if you're like me and you're a little bit of a masochist, those phone calls that come in from parents at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night or over the weekend, because you've had the opportunity as a clinician to evaluate how that device fits with the baby on their stomach, with the baby on their back. Every device that we fit in O&P, I would argue, looks great when the patient isn't moving. Right? I can make any helmet look great when that baby's sitting on their parent's lap, but what does it look like in the car seat? What does it look like when that kiddo is laying down to change for a diaper change? What does it look like when they're moving all over the place or perhaps, having a little bit of a tantrum? And I think it's cool that clinicians will be able to to assess that, and parents will have the confidence when they leave that office. I've put this on and taken it off a few times by myself. I didn't feel rushed, which I think is a lot of feedback that I saw in clinic. I felt really rushed when we went through. The most important piece was, how do I wear this? How do I wean it in? And how do I clean it? Because that's all the parent. And that's the information that as a clinician, we should be empowering them with when they leave our clinic.
Yeah, I love that. The empowerment factor is super important in this field, because once you leave the clinic, it's kind of on the parents, right, to take care of that. So that's great. Katie, before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to share or any final thoughts or advice to our listeners?
I think my biggest takeaway is just to give it a try. I mean, there's all these crows on the market. Ultimately, cranial remolding, as I talked about in the beginning of this podcast, is very simple. If you really want to simple it down, we're just making contact over areas where we don't want growth and allowing void space for places that we do. And with that, I think that we've kind of hit the peak of what cranial remolding can be with the Sprout 3D. We're using 3D printing to optimize the fit, the function, hopefully getting faster outcomes for your kiddos and less burden for the families. That was one of my big things is as a clinician who was seeing 150 cranials a year in my practice for many years, I didn't want to bring a device to the field or put my name even behind a device that I wasn't proud of. So I'm remarkably proud of the Sprout. And if you need any clinical advice, help, you need me to come check out a patient with you, please call me because I miss those babies. I'd love to get into offices and help out wherever I can, whether that be remote or, me coming out to you. But I think it's just a really cool thing. It's a really cool place to be in O&P right now. And I'm grateful to be where I am.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. This was awesome. You expanded my mind for sure, and I'm sure our listeners as well. And again, congratulations on such a terrific endeavor and the success you've got in creating such a cool product.
Yeah, it's really great stuff you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It's just, I could talk about it forever. So luckily we'll narrow it down to a podcast for now. But
we'll have you back about some outcomes and measures and see how it's going.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
That would be great.
We'd love to have you back.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.
To learn more about Sprout 3D Cranial Helmet and Katie's work at Surestep, follow the link in our show notes.
Thank you for listening to the O&P Check-in, an SPS podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, be sure to leave a review and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a question or topic suggestion? Email us at spspodcast@spsco.com. See you next time.